They thought I was finished. They said it quietly at first, then openly, and finally with the kind of laughter that only comes when people believe there is nothing left you can do to stop them. I was 63 years old when my wife decided I was no longer useful. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Not that she stopped loving me, I am not sure she ever did. Not really, but that she had extracted what she needed from 31 years of marriage and had made a quiet calculation that the remainder of my life would cost her more than it would give. Her name was Sandra. I called her Sandy for the first 20 years. Then just Sandra. Then, toward the end, nothing at all. I had built my career as a structural architect, bridges mostly, a few government contracts, one hospital wing that still stands in northern Ohio, and a consulting firm I ran for the better part of 2 decades before I sold it for more money than I ever expected to see in a single transaction. I was not wealthy by the standards of men who are talked about in newspapers, but I was comfortable. I had built something, and I had been careful with what I built, the way you are careful when you have spent your whole life making sure things do not fall down. Sandra had come from nothing, and I do not say that with cruelty. She was the daughter of a man who drank and a woman who worked 2 jobs and still came up short at the end of every month. She was hungry in a way that I understood, or thought I understood. I was attracted to her ambition. I mistook it for drive. It took me 30 years to understand the difference. We had 1 child together, or so I believed. Her name was Brooke. She was 27 when this story ends, and the part about her is the part that still cost me something to say out loud. I noticed things changing around the time I turned 58. Small things at first. Sandra's phone face down on the kitchen table. A weekend trip to see her sister in Columbus, that her sister later mentioned, in passing, she had not been told about. A second email account I found open on the shared laptop, which she explained as a spam account for online shopping, and which I accepted because I was not yet ready to stop accepting things. The man's name was Derek. He was 44 years old. He worked in commercial real estate and had, from what I could piece together, been in my wife's life for somewhere between 4 and 6 years before I found out for certain. I found out the way most men find out. Not all at once, but in accumulation. A receipt in her coat pocket from a restaurant we had never been to together. A text message she forgot to delete that used a name I did not recognize in a way that made the nature of the relationship unmistakable. A photograph on her phone that I saw by accident one evening when she asked me to check the time on it, and I picked it up from the counter at the wrong moment. I did not confront her immediately. That is the part people find difficult to understand. But I was 61 years old. I had spent 4 decades reading structural drawings, and I understood one thing with absolute clarity. You do not act on incomplete information. You assess the load before you touch a single beam. So I waited. And while I waited, I watched. What I saw over the following 14 months was a systematic and deliberate effort to move my money. It began with joint accounts. Sandra had always handled our household finances. This was an arrangement I had agreed to early in our marriage and never revisited because the bills were always paid, and I was too occupied with work to care about the details. What I did not know was that she had been quietly shifting money from our joint investment accounts into a separate account that held only her name, not large amounts at once. Never enough to trigger the kind of notification that would catch my attention. 2,000 here, 3,500 there. The patience of it is what frightened me most when I finally understood what I was looking at. I hired a forensic accountant. His name was Gerald, and he was referred to me by a man I had worked with on a federal contract in the early 2000s. Gerald was 67, retired from the IRS, and entirely without sentiment when it came to numbers. He spent 6 weeks reviewing every account, every transfer, every document he could access. When he came back to me, he sat down at my kitchen table with a manila folder and a cup of coffee and told me, without any particular inflection, that he had identified approximately $340,000, moved without my knowledge or signature over a period of 4 years. I asked him how she had done it. He told me some of it was forgery. My signature, replicated well enough to pass casual bank review. Some of it was legitimate joint accounts, where either party could act unilaterally. And some of it, the more recent transfers, had been done with the help of a notary whose license had expired 8 months earlier and who had, it appeared, continued notarizing documents as a favor to clients who did not ask questions. I sat with that information for 3 days. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to an attorney named Patricia, who had been recommended to me by a colleague and who specialized in asset recovery and matrimonial fraud. The second was to my old friend Walt, who had retired from the county sheriff's office 5 years earlier and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive. Walt came over on a Tuesday evening, and we sat on the back porch for 2 hours. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I always respected about him. When I was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Arthur, you need to let her think she's winning." That became the plan. For the next 4 months, I lived in my own house like a man who did not know what was happening. I came home at my regular time. I ate dinner across from my wife and made conversation about the weather and the neighbors and whatever was on television. I watched her relax. I watched her confidence grow. I watched her make mistakes. She began speaking more openly on the phone. She stopped worrying about whether I was in the next room. Twice, she had Derek over to the house while I was supposedly away visiting my brother in Pittsburgh. I was not in Pittsburgh either time. I was parked 2 blocks away, because Walt had suggested I document what I could. And Walt had also suggested I not do anything that could be characterized as breaking and entering. What Sandra did not know, what neither she nor Derek nor Brooke knew, was that I had, with Patricia's guidance, and within the full scope of what the law allows, installed a recording device in the common area of my home. Not in bedrooms, not in bathrooms, in the living room and the kitchen and the home office that had, over the previous year, started to feel less like mine. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I do not say. I consulted with Patricia before I did anything. Every step I took was documented and reviewed. I was not a man acting out of rage. I was a man building a structure, and like every structure I had ever built, it had to hold weight. The recording I will tell you about happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. I had left the house at my regular time. By 11 o'clock, Sandra and Derek were in the kitchen. I know what was said because I sat in my car in a parking garage downtown and listened through the small device Walt had shown me how to use, and I took notes in a yellow legal pad in handwriting, so small and careful that Patricia later told me it looked like engineering notation. What they discussed, in comfortable detail, was the plan for the hearing. Sandra's attorney had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier. This was not a surprise to me. Patricia had been expecting it and had prepared accordingly. What Sandra's attorney did not know was that our entire financial picture had been restructured over the preceding months. The accounts she thought she had been siphoning from had been, in several cases, legally moved into trust instruments that Patricia had established on my behalf. The money was still mine, but it was no longer in the places Sandra believed it to be. Derek told her, in the kitchen of my house, that the hearing was going to be simple. He said the forensic work they had done would demonstrate that the marital assets were substantially what Sandra had declared, and that my share of the consulting firm's sale had largely been depleted through shared expenditures over the years. He said, and I wrote this down word for word, "He's going to walk out of that courtroom with whatever you decide to leave him, and that's it." Sandra laughed. Not a small laugh, a full satisfied laugh that I had not heard from her in years. Brooke was there too. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She said, "And he still doesn't know about the property in Tennessee?" Sandra said, "He doesn't know about anything." The property in Tennessee was a parcel of land Sandra had purchased in her name alone, using the transferred funds. 4 acres outside of Nashville that she and Derek had, according to what Gerald had found in county records, already begun developing permits on. It was the cleanest example of marital asset conversion that Patricia said she had seen in 15 years of practice. And it was, as it turned out, the thread that unraveled everything else. I dressed carefully the morning of the hearing. I want to say that plainly, because it mattered to me. I wore a charcoal gray suit that I had bought 6 years ago for a project award ceremony and had dry cleaned twice since. I shaved. I wore cufflinks that had belonged to my father. I looked, when I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, like a man who had built things and was not done building them. Patricia had arranged for Gerald to appear as an expert witness. Walt would be in the gallery. My attorney had filed, the night before the hearing, a supplemental disclosure document that included a sealed envelope addressed to the judge with a handwritten note on the outside that read, "To be opened at the court's discretion if the authenticity of financial disclosures is disputed." Patricia had advised me not to discuss the contents of that envelope with anyone before the hearing. I followed her advice. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the kind of room that makes everyone look tired. Sandra came in with her attorney, and Derek sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind her, which the bailiff permitted because no one had told him he shouldn't. Brooke sat beside him. They were, all three of them, dressed as though they were attending a pleasant lunch. Sandra looked at me when she sat down. She looked at my suit. Something moved across her face. Not doubt exactly, but something adjacent to it, and then she looked away. Her attorney opened by presenting their version of the marital finances. It was a confident presentation. The documents were professionally bound. Her attorney was polished and practiced, and spoke with the specific fluency of someone who has said similar things in similar rooms many times. He described the marital assets as largely consumed. The consulting firm proceeds as substantially reinvested and depreciated, and Sandra's separate accounts as her own earnings from her small interior design practice, which she had operated out of our home for the past decade. When he was done, the judge, a man named Calloway, perhaps 60 himself, with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose, looked at Patricia and said, "Counselor?" Patricia stood. She was composed in a way that reminded me of the best engineers I had ever worked with. She presented Gerald as an expert witness. He testified for 40 minutes. He spoke in the flat, technical language of someone who has spent decades reading numbers and knows exactly where the bodies are buried. He detailed every transfer. He named the accounts. He presented the Tennessee property records. He showed, transaction by transaction, the 4-year movement of $340,000. Sandra's attorney objected several times. The judge overruled him each time without apparent difficulty. At one point during Gerald's testimony, I glanced back at the gallery. Derek was no longer smiling. Brooke was looking at her phone. Sandra was writing something on a notepad and passing it to her attorney, and her attorney was reading it with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating something. When Gerald stepped down, Patricia said, "Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to draw the court's attention to the sealed envelope previously entered into the record." The judge picked it up. He examined the outside. He looked over his glasses at Patricia and said, "This is the audio documentation you referenced in your filing?" Patricia said, "It is, Your Honor. A transcript is included. The original recording has been authenticated by a forensic audio specialist whose credentials are detailed in the accompanying documentation." The judge broke the seal. He read for perhaps 3 minutes. The courtroom was very quiet. Then he put the pages down, removed his glasses entirely, and looked at Sandra's attorney with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite disbelief, but somewhere between the two. He said, "Counselor, I'm going to need you to step back for a moment." What followed was not a dramatic single moment. It was a series of events that unfolded over the next 2 hours with the slow, grinding momentum of a structural failure. The kind where the building does not fall all at once, but where each support gives way in sequence, and you can watch it happen if you know where to look. Sandra's attorney requested a recess. It was granted. During the recess, 2 things happened. First, Derek was asked to leave the gallery by the bailiff, on the judge's instruction, pending a review of his potential status as a party to the proceedings. Second, a representative from the county district attorney's office, who had been contacted by Patricia 3 weeks earlier, and who had been sitting in the back of the gallery in a dark jacket and no tie, stood up and identified himself to the court clerk. When we reconvened, the judge addressed Sandra's attorney directly and told him that the documentation before the court raised concerns that went beyond the civil division of marital assets. He used the phrase potential criminal referral twice. He was not heated about it. He said it the way a structural engineer says load-bearing wall is a fact, not a threat. Sandra turned and looked at me for the first time since the morning. I did not look away. Her attorney made an argument about the admissibility of the recording. Patricia had anticipated this. She had prepared a 20-page brief on exactly this question, filed as a supplemental exhibit which the judge reviewed in part during the recess. His ruling on admissibility was brief, and for our purposes, complete. The civil hearing concluded with an asset division that bore almost no resemblance to what Sandra had expected. The Tennessee property was identified as marital property acquired through fraudulent transfer and was ordered to be liquidated with proceeds returned to the marital estate. The $340,000 was addressed in the settlement terms in language that Patricia had drafted and that the judge adopted almost verbatim. 3 months later, Sandra and Derek were each charged with 1 count of financial fraud and 1 count of forgery. The expired notary was charged separately. Sandra's sentencing came 8 months after the civil hearing. She received 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and a restitution order covering the full amount of the fraudulent transfers plus interest. Derek received a suspended sentence of 2 years, conditional on full restitution and no contact with me or my legal representatives. The notary lost what remained of his professional standing and was fined. I want to tell you about Brooke, because leaving her out would be dishonest. She called me 6 weeks after the sentencing. I almost did not answer. I had not spoken to her since before the hearing, and the recording from the kitchen, her voice, her casual certainty that I did not know anything, had settled into a place inside me that I was still trying to understand. I answered because I am 63 years old, and I have buried 2 friends and 1 brother in the past decade, and I have learned that there are some conversations you cannot postpone indefinitely. She did not apologize immediately. She started with excuses, the way people do when they are not yet sure whether they are apologizing or defending themselves. She said she had not known the full extent of what her mother was doing. She said she had believed my share of the assets genuinely was what Sandra had represented. She said she felt caught in the middle. I listened. When she was finished, I said, "Brooke, I raised you for 24 years. I coached your soccer team. I sat in the hospital with you when you had your appendix out at 14. I do not need you to explain to me what you knew and when you knew it. What I need, if we are going to have any kind of relationship going forward, is for you to tell me the truth." There was a long silence. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I should have called you. It was not everything, but it was a beginning. I sold the house that fall. It was too large for one person, and the market was favorable, and I had spent too many evenings in those rooms feeling the shape of what was gone. I bought a smaller place near the water, about 40 minutes outside of the city, with a porch that faces west and catches the light in the late afternoon in a way that still makes me stop whatever I am doing when I see it. Walt came over the first week I moved in, and we sat on that porch with 2 bottles of whatever he had brought from his house, and he said, 'You know what the thing about all of this is?' I said I did not. He said, 'They handed you everything. Every single piece of it, they handed to you. You didn't have to be clever. You just had to be patient.' He was right. That is the truth of it. Sandra and Derek were meticulous about what they took, but they were careless about where they talked and what they said and how certain they allowed themselves to become. Certainty is the most dangerous condition I know. I have watched certainty bring down buildings. I have watched it ruin people. A man who is certain he has won stops checking the calculations. I checked mine every single day for 14 months. There is a thing they do not tell you about surviving something like this. They do not tell you that the anger comes later, after the legal proceedings are finished and the documents are signed and the accounts are settled. While everything was happening, I was focused. I had a structure to maintain. But in the quiet months afterward, I found myself sitting on that west-facing porch at the end of the day, thinking about 31 years, about the person I had believed I was building something with, about all the ordinary mornings and unremarkable Sundays that had felt, at the time, like enough. I am not a man who is comfortable with grief. I spent my career learning to control variables, and grief is not a variable that responds to control. But I am learning. Patricia told me, when it was all concluded, that the case would likely be cited in her future practice. She said the combination of forensic accounting documentation, authenticated audio, and preemptive trust restructuring was as complete a preparation as she had seen from a non-attorney client. She said this as a compliment. I took it as one. Gerald sent me a short email after the sentencing, It said, "Nice work. Enjoy your retirement." That was all. I appreciated the economy of it. Brooke and I have dinner once a month now. It is still careful. There are things we do not discuss and things we are slowly learning to say. She looks sometimes like she is carrying something heavy, and I do not know yet whether I am the right person to help her put it down. But I am trying to find out. I think about the morning of the hearing sometimes, standing in front of that bathroom mirror in my father's cufflinks. The deliberate, careful act of presenting myself as I actually was, not diminished, not broken, not the man they had decided I was. There was something in that, something that mattered independent of everything that followed. You spend enough years building things, and you learn that the material does not care about your intentions. Steel and concrete and load-bearing stone do not reward optimism or punish despair. They respond to design, to preparation, to the slow, unglamorous work of getting it right before you commit. That is what I had. Not cleverness, not luck. I had done the work. And when the weight came, the structure held.